There's an internal voice running almost constantly in your head, narrating your day, evaluating your performance, rehearsing conversations that already happened or haven't happened yet. And most people never stop to examine it critically. They just assume it's simply who they are, an unchangeable, built-in feature of their own mind. But a growing body of neuroscience research suggests this internal voice, what researchers call self-talk, isn't a fixed passive narrator at all. It's an active process that shapes attention, emotion regulation, stress physiology, and even measurable brain activity. And critically, it's a process you have considerably more influence over than most people realize. I want to walk you through what the actual research says about how self-talk works in the brain, why certain patterns of internal dialogue appear to genuinely change your physiological stress response, and what specific evidence-based techniques can shift this internal voice in a direction that actually supports you rather than working against you. Let's start with what's actually happening neurologically when you talk to yourself, because I think this is genuinely more interesting and more mechanistically concrete than most people assume. Research using functional MRI has found that inner speech, the silent internal verbal narration most people experience, activates many of the same brain regions involved in actual spoken language production and comprehension, including Broca's area, traditionally associated with speech production, and Wernicke's area, traditionally associated with language comprehension, despite no audible speech actually occurring. Citation, this activation of language processing brain regions during silent inner speech, has been demonstrated across neuroimaging research published in journals including Neuroimage and Cerebral Cortex. This isn't simply a metaphor. When you talk to yourself internally, you're engaging genuine, measurable neural language processing machinery, largely the same machinery involved when you speak or listen to someone else. This matters enormously for understanding why self-talk carries the psychological and physiological weight it does, because inner speech recruits genuine language processing systems, and because language itself carries emotional and evaluative content, not just neutral information. The specific words and framing you use internally appear to activate downstream emotional and physiological responses in a way that's considerably more direct and consequential than most people assume when they think of self-talk, as simply idle, inconsequential mental chatter. I want to bring in the concept of what psychologist Ethan Kross and his colleagues have termed chatter, specifically referring to the negative, cyclical, self-focused rumination that a lot of people experience, particularly during periods of stress. And the research examining this specific pattern has found it associated with measurably worse outcomes across multiple domains, elevated cortisol reactivity to stress, impaired problem-solving performance, and increased risk for anxiety and depressive symptoms over time. Citation, this body of research on negative ruminative self-talk, termed chatter, and its measurable physiological and psychological consequences has been published extensively by Kross and colleagues in journals including Psychological Science and summarized in Kross's book Chatter, drawing on peer-reviewed research from his laboratory at the University of Michigan. This research program is genuinely important because it moves the conversation about self-talk beyond vague motivational poster-level advice and into something considerably more rigorous, specific, measurable neurological and physiological consequences tied to specific patterns of internal dialogue. Let me talk about the default mode network here, since we've touched on this brain system in a previous video on meditation and religious experience, but it deserves fuller, more specific treatment in the context of self-talk and rumination. The default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, becomes active during self-referential thought, when your mind isn't focused on an external task and instead turns inward toward memories, self-evaluation, and mental time travel into the past or future. Citation, this default mode network and its role in self-referential processing has been established extensively in cognitive neuroscience research, published in journals including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Research has found that excessive ruminative activity within this network, particularly patterns involving repetitive, negatively toned self-referential thought, is associated with elevated symptoms of depression and anxiety. And some studies have found that individuals with clinical depression show altered, often hyperconnected activity within specific default mode network regions during rumination compared to non-depressed individuals. Citation: this relationship between default mode network hyperactivity and hyperconnectivity during rumination and depressive symptoms specifically has been examined in clinical neuroscience research published in journals including Biological Psychiatry and JAMA Psychiatry. I want to be genuinely careful and precise here about what this research does and doesn't establish, because I think it's easy for this kind of finding to get oversimplified into something that sounds more deterministic than the evidence actually supports. This research doesn't establish that everyone who experiences occasional negative self-talk has some kind of neurological abnormality. Negative thoughts and self-critical moments are a normal, universal part of human cognition. And the research we're discussing specifically examines patterns of chronic, repetitive, difficult to disengage from rumination, not the ordinary, passing self-criticism that everyone experiences from time to time. The distinction between occasional, normal self-critical thoughts and the kind of chronic, difficult to interrupt rumination, this research specifically examines matters considerably. And I don't want anything in this video to pathologize normal, everyday internal experience. Let me bring in the physiological consequences of negative self-talk and rumination more directly now, because I think this is genuinely one of the more compelling, concrete pieces of this entire conversation. Research examining rumination and cortisol has found that individuals who engage in more ruminative thinking following a stressful event show prolonged elevated cortisol levels, sometimes for hours, longer than individuals who don't engage in the same degree of rumination following an identical stressor. Citation: this relationship between ruminative thinking following stress and prolonged cortisol elevation has been examined in psychoneuroendocrinology research published in journals including Psychoneuroendocrinology and Health Psychology. This is genuinely important because it demonstrates that the internal, purely mental process of rumination isn't confined to your subjective experience. It appears to genuinely extend and prolong your body's physiological stress response well beyond the duration of the original stressful event itself. In other words, the stressful event ends, but if your internal narration about that event continues in a ruminative, negatively focused pattern, your body's stress physiology appears to continue responding as though the stressor were still actively present. If you want the full structured breakdown of exactly how to apply the specific self-talk techniques we're going to cover in this video, along with practical daily exercises for building healthier patterns of internal dialogue over time, I put together a couple of ebooks that walk through this in a lot more practical detail than I can cover in a single video. They're linked down in the description below. And if this topic resonates with you, if you've noticed your own internal voice tends to run more critical or ruminative than you'd like, I genuinely encourage you to go check them out. Let's talk now about one of the more genuinely well-studied, evidence-based techniques for actually shifting the tone and effectiveness of your internal dialogue, which is something researchers call self-distancing. And I think this represents one of the more immediately actionable, surprisingly simple findings in this entire body of research. Self-distancing refers to the practice of reflecting on your own experiences from a psychologically distanced perspective rather than an immersed first-person perspective. And one of the most studied specific techniques for achieving this is remarkably simple. Using your own name or a second-person pronoun like you rather than I when talking to yourself internally about a difficult situation. Citation: this self-distancing technique and its measurable psychological and physiological benefits have been examined extensively in research led by Ethan Cross and colleagues, published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and Clinical Psychological Science. I want to walk through the actual research demonstrating why this works, because I think the mechanism is genuinely fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive. Studies have found that when people prepare for a stressful task, like a public speaking exercise, using distant self-talk, silently coaching themselves using their own name, Sarah, you've got this, you've prepared well, rather than immersed first-person self-talk, I've got this, I've prepared well. They show measurably reduced anxiety, improve performance on the subsequent task, and in some studies using neuroimaging, reduced activity in brain regions associated with threat-related emotional processing. Citation, Moser and colleagues, this research, examining distance versus immersed self-talk and their differential effects on anxiety, performance, and neural threat processing activity has been published in journals including Scientific Reports and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. Researchers have proposed that using your own name or a second-person framing creates genuine psychological distance from the immediate emotional intensity of a situation, allowing you to access the same kind of wise, rational perspective you'd naturally offer a friend going through the same difficulty, rather than remaining immersed in the immediate emotional experience that tends to narrow thinking and amplify anxiety when you're speaking to yourself in the immersed first person. This connects to something genuinely important that I think a lot of people intuitively recognize, but rarely apply to themselves. Most people are considerably better at offering wise, compassionate, effective advice to a friend going through a difficult situation than they are at applying that same wisdom to their own identical situation. And self-distancing through name-based or second-person self-talk appears to be a genuinely evidence-supported technique for closing that gap, allowing you to access more of that same outside, less emotionally enmeshed perspective when reflecting on your own experience. Citation, this general phenomenon of people showing better problem-solving and advice-giving capacity for others' problems compared to their own, and self-distancing's role in narrowing this gap, has been discussed extensively in the broader self-talk and psychological distancing research literature we've referenced throughout this section. I want to bring in something about the research on flash-forward and flashback distancing techniques here as well, since these represent additional related self-distancing approaches worth knowing about beyond the name-based technique we just discussed. Temporal distancing, mentally projecting yourself forward in time and imagining how you'll feel about a current stressful situation from that future vantage point 10 years from now, or even simply a year from now, has also been found in research to reduce the emotional intensity of current distress and improve emotion regulation. Citation, this temporal distancing technique and its emotion regulation benefits has been examined in research published in journals including Psychological Science, building on the broader self-distancing research framework. This works through a related but distinct mechanism from the name-based technique. Rather than distancing yourself from the immediate emotional intensity through altered pronoun use, you're distancing yourself through altered temporal perspective, both approaches appearing to tap into the same underlying capacity for shifting from an immersed, narrow emotional processing mode into a broader, more reflective, more effective, evaluative mode. Let me talk about self-compassion research now, since I think this represents another genuinely important, extensively studied body of work that connects directly to this entire conversation about self-talk. Self-compassion, as studied and defined extensively by researcher Kristin Neff, involves treating yourself with the same kindness, understanding, and support during difficult moments that you'd naturally offer a good friend, rather than the harsh, critical self-talk that a lot of people default to. And it's typically broken down into three core components: self-kindness rather than self-judgment, recognizing common humanity rather than isolation, meaning understanding that struggle and imperfection are part of the shared human experience rather than something uniquely, shamefully wrong with you specifically, and mindfulness rather than over-identification with difficult emotions, meaning acknowledging painful feelings without either suppressing them or becoming completely consumed by them. Citation, this self-compassion framework and its three core components have been established extensively in psychological research led by Kristin Neff, published in journals including Self and Identity, and summarized across numerous subsequent studies applying this framework. Research on self-compassion has found it associated with a genuinely broad range of favorable outcomes, including reduced anxiety and depressive symptoms, greater resilience following failure or setback, and, importantly for this conversation, measurably different physiological stress responses compared to individuals scoring lower on self-compassion measures, including some research finding that higher self-compassion is associated with lower cortisol reactivity and, In some studies, more favorable heart rate variability patterns during stressful tasks, citation, this relationship between self-compassion and favorable physiological stress markers has been examined in research published in journals including Psychoneuroendocrinology and Mindfulness. I want to address something that comes up frequently as a misconception about self-compassion specifically, since I think it deserves direct correction. Self-compassion is not the same thing as low standards, self-indulgence, or a lack of accountability. And research directly examining this concern has actually found the opposite pattern. Individuals higher in self-compassion tend to show greater, not lesser, personal accountability and motivation to improve following a genuine mistake or failure, likely because self-compassion reduces the fear of self-judgment that often causes people to avoid honestly confronting their own mistakes in the first place. Citation, this research addressing and refuting the common misconception that self-compassion undermines accountability or motivation has been examined in studies published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and Self-Identity. Let me bring in the developmental origins of self-talk patterns here, since I think this adds genuinely useful context for understanding why some people's internal voice tends to run considerably more critical than others, without pathologizing anyone's specific experience. Research in developmental psychology has found that children's early self-talk patterns appear to be meaningfully influenced by the language and tone caregivers use when speaking to and about the child, with some research finding that children gradually internalize the specific evaluative language patterns modeled by important adults in their early environment, eventually incorporating this language into their own independent internal self-talk as they mature. Citation. This developmental research on the internalization of caregiver language patterns into a child's independent self-talk has been examined extensively in developmental psychology literature, drawing on foundational work in this area, including research building on Vygotsky's theory of inner speech development and subsequent empirical research on parent-child language interaction and self-regulation. Development. I want to be genuinely careful and precise about how I frame this, because I don't want this to come across as blame directed at anyone's family or upbringing. This is simply useful, evidence-based context for understanding why self-talk patterns can feel so deeply ingrained and automatic. They were, to a meaningful degree, learned early through a process that happened well before most people had the cognitive capacity to critically evaluate or choose the specific patterns being modeled to them. This is actually, I think, genuinely encouraging context rather than discouraging, because if these patterns were learned through a process of language exposure and internalization, then the same underlying neuroplasticity that allowed those patterns to form in the first place means they remain genuinely evidence-supported, modifiable in adulthood through the kind of deliberate techniques we're discussing throughout this video, even if that modification requires more conscious, sustained effort than the largely unconscious process through which the original patterns were first established. Let me talk about cognitive behavioral therapy here specifically, since it represents one of the most extensively researched, clinically validated approaches for directly addressing unhelpful self-talk and thought patterns, and I think it deserves genuine, direct attention in this conversation. Cognitive behavioral therapy is built substantially around the principle that our thoughts, including our internal self-talk, meaningfully shape our emotions and behaviors, and that identifying and restructuring unhelpful, distorted thought patterns, sometimes called cognitive distortions, catastrophizing, black and white thinking, mind reading, among others, can produce measurable improvements in mood and functioning. Citation. This cognitive behavioral therapy framework and its extensive evidence base for treating anxiety and depressive symptoms has been established across decades of clinical psychology research, with foundational work by researchers including Aaron Beck and summarized in numerous meta-analyses published in journals including Clinical Psychology Review, demonstrating its efficacy across a range of conditions. Neuroimaging research examining the effects of cognitive behavioral therapy specifically has found measurable changes in brain activity patterns following successful treatment, including changes in prefrontal cortex regulation of emotional processing regions like the amygdala, suggesting that the therapeutic process of restructuring self-talk and thought patterns produces genuine, measurable neurological change, not simply subjective self-reported improvement without underlying physiological correlate. Citation, this neuroimaging research demonstrating measurable brain activity changes following cognitive behavioral therapy has been published in journals including the American Journal of Psychiatry and Biological Psychiatry. I want to bring in something about the specific technique of cognitive reappraisal here, since it connects directly to the self-talk conversation and represents one of the more thoroughly researched emotion regulation strategies in the entire psychological literature. Cognitive reappraisal involves deliberately reframing how you think about and talk to yourself about a given situation in order to change its emotional impact. For instance, reframing a nerve-wracking public speaking opportunity from "this is dangerous and I might fail" toward "this is exciting and I have a genuine opportunity to share something I care about and research." Comparing cognitive reappraisal against suppression, meaning simply trying to hide or push away difficult emotions without actually reframing your internal narrative about them, has consistently found reappraisal to be considerably more effective, both subjectively and in terms of measurable physiological stress markers. Citation, this comparative research on cognitive reappraisal versus emotional suppression and reappraisal's superior effectiveness for genuine emotion regulation has been examined extensively in research led by James Gross and colleagues, published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. I want to be honest and precise about a genuinely important nuance here, because I think a lot of popular content oversimplifies cognitive reappraisal into something that sounds like simply thinking positive or denying genuine difficulty. And that's not quite an accurate representation of what the actual technique or the research supporting it actually involves. Effective cognitive reappraisal isn't about denying that a situation is difficult or forcing an artificially positive spin onto something genuinely negative. Research has found that this kind of forced, inauthentic positivity can actually be counterproductive and sometimes even increase distress rather than reducing it. Citation, this counterproductive effect of forced or inauthentic positive reframing, as distinct from genuine, accurate cognitive reappraisal, has been discussed in emotion regulation research examining the boundary conditions and limitations of reappraisal effectiveness. Effective reappraisal instead involves finding a genuinely more accurate, more useful way of thinking and talking to yourself about a situation, one that acknowledges real difficulty honestly, while also identifying genuine, accurate alternative framings, opportunities, sources of meaning, or evidence that challenges an overly catastrophic initial interpretation, rather than simply painting over genuine difficulty with forced cheerfulness. Let me address something about affirmation specifically here, since this is a topic that generates considerable skepticism, sometimes justified, and I think it deserves careful, honest treatment rather than either uncritical endorsement or blanket dismissal. Research on self-affirmation, a specific psychological construct distinct from the popular, more generic use of the term affirmations you might encounter in casual self-help content, has generally examined the practice of reflecting on and affirming your own core personal values, rather than simply repeating generic positive statements about yourself. And this specific values-based form of self-affirmation has been found in research to genuinely reduce defensive processing of threatening information and improve performance under stress. Citation, this self-affirmation theory research, involving reflection on core personal values specifically, has been established extensively by researcher Claude Steele and subsequent researchers, published in journals including Psychological Science and summarized in meta-analyses on self-affirmation interventions. I want to be genuinely direct about the distinction between this specific values-based research and the more generic, repetitive positive statement affirmations that get discussed heavily in popular self-help content, since I think this distinction matters considerably for setting appropriate expectations. Research specifically examining generic, repeated positive self-statements, "I am a successful and confident person," repeated without any specific reflection on genuine personal values or evidence, has found more mixed results, with some research finding these generic affirmations can actually backfire for individuals with genuinely low self-esteem, since the statement's clear disconnect from that person's actual self-perception can itself become a source of additional distress or defensive resistance. Citation, this more mixed, sometimes counterproductive effect of generic positive self-affirmations, particularly in individuals with low baseline self-esteem, has been examined in research published in Psychological Science by researchers, including Joanne Wood and colleagues. This is a genuinely important, honest correction I want to make to a lot of oversimplified popular content on this specific topic. The well-supported research specifically favors values-based reflection and genuinely accurate, specific, evidence-based reappraisal rather than generic, repeated positive statements disconnected from your actual genuine self-perception and circumstances. Let me bring this back to something more directly practical and actionable now, walking through what I think are the genuinely evidence-based techniques worth actually incorporating into your own daily internal dialogue based on everything we've covered throughout this video. First, practice self-distancing during genuinely difficult or stressful moments, specifically using your own name or a second-person you, framing when talking to yourself internally about a challenge, rather than the immersed first-person I framing that tends to keep you locked into the immediate emotional intensity of a situation. Second, when you notice yourself engaged in prolonged, ruminative replaying of a difficult event, particularly one that's already resolved or that you have limited remaining ability to influence, try the temporal distancing technique, deliberately asking yourself how you'll likely view the situation in a year or in 10 years, which tends to genuinely shrink its immediate emotional weight without requiring you to deny or suppress the genuine difficulty involved. Third, when you catch yourself in a pattern of harsh self-criticism following a mistake or setback, deliberately practice self-compassion by asking yourself what you'd actually say to a good friend in the identical situation, and then extend that same genuine kindness and perspective to yourself, remembering the research we discussed, showing this approach tends to produce greater, not lesser, accountability and motivation to improve, not the self-indulgent complacency that critics of self-compassion sometimes assume it produces. Fourth, practice genuine, accurate cognitive reappraisal rather than either harsh, catastrophizing self-talk or forced, inauthentic positivity, specifically asking yourself what a more accurate, complete way of thinking about a difficult situation might look like, one that honestly acknowledges genuine difficulty while also identifying genuine evidence-based alternative framings you might be missing in the heat of an initial, more catastrophic reaction. And fifth, if you're drawn to something like affirmations specifically, focus on genuine, specific reflection on your actual core values and genuine past evidence of your own capability rather than generic, repeated positive statements disconnected from your actual self-perception, since the research we discussed suggests this specific values-based approach carries considerably more genuine evidence behind it than the more generic version of this practice that's become popular in casual self-help content. I want to address something about consistency in practice here, because I think this is genuinely important context that a lot of content covering this topic skips over. These techniques, self-distancing, self-compassion, cognitive reappraisal, aren't things that typically produce their full benefit from a single isolated application during one particularly difficult moment. Research on the neuroplastic changes underlying sustained shifts in self-talk patterns generally finds that meaningful, durable change requires consistent, repeated practice over a period of weeks to months, similar to how we've discussed physical training adaptations requiring consistent effort over time throughout other videos in different contexts. Citation: this general principle that sustained neuroplastic change underlying durable shifts in emotion, regulation, and self-talk patterns requires consistent, repeated practice over an extended period has been discussed in clinical psychology and neuroplasticity research, examining the time course of therapeutic change published across cognitive behavioral therapy outcome literature. This isn't meant to be discouraging, quite the opposite. It's meant to set realistic, evidence-based expectations. If you try one of these techniques once during a single difficult moment and don't notice a dramatic, immediate transformation, that doesn't mean the technique doesn't work. It means consistent with how essentially every other form of genuine skill development and neuroplastic adaptation we've discussed throughout this entire channel actually works, that meaningful change requires sustained, consistent practice over time, not a single isolated application. Let me address something about journaling here as well, since it connects directly to self-talk and represents another well-studied technique worth mentioning. Expressive writing, specifically writing about difficult emotional experiences for a brief period, typically 15 to 20 minutes across several consecutive days, has been studied extensively since foundational research by psychologist James Pennebaker and has been found to produce measurable benefits, including improved mood, reduced rumination, and even some research finding improved immune function markers following a structured expressive writing intervention, citation. This expressive writing research and its measurable psychological and physiological benefits has been established through decades of research led by James Pennebaker and subsequent researchers, published in journals including Psychosomatic Medicine and the Journal of Consulting in Clinical Psychology. I think journaling connects meaningfully to everything we've discussed throughout this video because the act of writing, unlike purely internal, often rapid and somewhat unstructured internal dialogue, tends to naturally slow down and structure your thinking, providing a kind of built-in distancing and reappraisal opportunity simply through the process of translating internal experience into deliberate, organized written language. I want to spend some time now addressing a question that I think naturally arises from everything we've discussed, which is whether these self-talk techniques are sufficient on their own for individuals experiencing genuinely significant, persistent anxiety or depressive symptoms, or whether professional support remains important alongside or instead of self-directed techniques like the ones we've discussed throughout this video. The techniques we've covered, self-distancing, self-compassion, cognitive reappraisal, journaling, all have genuine research-supported evidence bases, and many of them are drawn directly from or closely related to techniques used within formal cognitive behavioral therapy itself. However, for individuals experiencing persistent, significant symptoms of anxiety or depression that meaningfully interfere with daily functioning, these self-directed techniques, while genuinely valuable and evidence-based as a component of care, are generally most effective and appropriately used alongside, rather than as a complete substitute for working with a qualified mental health professional who can provide personalized, structured support and appropriately assess whether additional treatment approaches might be beneficial. Let me bring in something about the relationship between self-talk and physical performance here as well, since I think this offers a genuinely interesting, concrete illustration of everything we've discussed, connecting this psychological conversation back to some of the physical training content we've covered elsewhere on this channel. Research examining self-talk, specifically in athletic and physical performance contexts, has found that instructional self-talk, specific technique-focused internal cues relevant to a task, and motivational self-talk, encouraging effort-focused internal dialogue, both produce measurable performance benefits compared to no deliberate self-talk strategy at all, with instructional self-talk showing particular benefit for tasks requiring precision and technical skill, and motivational self-talk showing particular benefit for tasks requiring sustained effort and endurance. Citation: this research on instructional versus motivational self-talk and their differential performance benefits across different types of physical tasks has been examined extensively in sports psychology research, summarized in meta-analyses published in Perspectives on Psychological Science. This offers a genuinely concrete, immediately testable application of everything we've discussed if you're engaged in resistance training or any physical performance context we've covered elsewhere on this channel. Deliberately structuring your internal self-talk, whether technical, instructional cues during a lift, or encouraging effort-focused language during a challenging set, represents a genuinely evidence-supported tool that extends well beyond purely emotional well-being into measurable physical performance as well. Let me bring this entire considerably long conversation together now into a clear, practical summary, because I think this represents genuinely important, actionable information about a process most people have simply never examined critically before. Your internal self-talk isn't passive, inconsequential mental background noise. It recruits genuine language processing, brain machinery, and specific patterns of self-talk particularly chronic, ruminative, negative self-talk, are associated with measurable, prolonged physiological stress responses, altered default mode network activity, and elevated risk for anxiety and depressive symptoms over time. Critically, and this is the piece I most want you to walk away with, these patterns are genuinely modifiable through specific, well-researched techniques, including self-distancing, using your own name or second-person framing during difficult moments, temporal distancing, deliberately projecting your future perspective on current difficulties, self-compassion, extending the same kindness to yourself that you'd naturally offer a good friend, genuine, accurate cognitive reappraisal, rather than either catastrophizing or forced positivity, and for those specifically drawn to it, values-based self-affirmation rather than generic, disconnected, positive statements. None of these techniques require any special equipment, any financial cost, or any dramatic lifestyle change. They require consistent, deliberate practice applied to something you're already doing constantly every single day, whether you've ever consciously examined it or not. The ongoing internal conversation you're having with yourself. If there's one thing I want you to take from this entire video, it's this. The voice in your head that narrates your daily experience, evaluates your performance, and shapes how you interpret both success and difficulty is not simply a fixed, unchangeable feature of who you are. It's a learned pattern, shaped initially by early developmental influences largely outside your control, but genuinely evidence-supported, modifiable in adulthood through deliberate, consistent practice of the specific techniques we've covered throughout this video. The way you talk to yourself is quite literally shaping measurable patterns of brain activity and physiological stress response, and learning to shift that internal dialogue, not through denial or forced positivity, but through genuine evidence-based techniques like distancing and self-compassion, represents one of the more accessible, powerful, and underutilized tools available for supporting your own long-term psychological and physical well-being. Before we wrap up, if you want the complete structured system for actually building these techniques into your daily life, including specific daily practice exercises for self-distancing, self-compassion, and cognitive reappraisal, and a genuinely practical framework for tracking how your own internal dialogue shifts over time, all of that is laid out in considerably more depth in the ebooks I've linked in the description below. If you've made it through this entire video, you clearly want to understand and actually improve your relationship with your own internal voice, rather than simply continuing to let it run on autopilot. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource built to help you take everything we've covered today and turn it into a genuine, sustained shift in how you talk to yourself starting today. There's more depth I want to add here, because there are several genuinely important pieces of this research I've only briefly mentioned, and I think this topic deserves the fuller treatment. Let me go deeper into the linguistic research on self-talk specifically, because I think there's a genuinely fascinating body of work here that most people have never encountered. Beyond the pronoun-based self-distancing we discussed earlier, researchers have examined the broader linguistic patterns people use in their self-talk and found that certain word choices carry measurably different psychological weight. Research analyzing language use in personal writing and speech has found that individuals who use more absolute all-or-nothing language internally, words like always, never, completely, totally, when describing their own perceived failures or shortcomings, show higher rates of depressive symptoms compared to individuals using more qualified, nuanced language, citation. This relationship between absolutist language use and depressive symptomatology has been examined in computational linguistics and clinical psychology research published in journals including Clinical Psychological Science, analyzing large text corpora from online forums and personal writing samples across clinical and non-clinical populations. This offers a genuinely concrete, specific target for self-observation if you notice your own internal dialogue frequently reaching for absolute all-or-nothing language when evaluating yourself. I always mess this up. I'm completely incapable of this. That specific linguistic pattern itself, independent of the broader content, appears to be a meaningful marker worth paying attention to and deliberately working to soften toward more accurate, qualified language. I want to bring in something about the specific difference between I am statements and I feel or I did statements here as well, since I think this represents a genuinely useful, granular linguistic distinction. Research on self-concept and identity-based language has found that framing difficulties in terms of stable identity, I am a failure, tends to be considerably more psychologically damaging and harder to update than framing the same difficulty in terms of a specific behavior or temporary state. I failed at this particular task, or I'm feeling discouraged right now. Citation, this distinction between identity-based and behavior-based self-talk framing and its differential psychological impact has been examined in research on self-concept and cognitive restructuring, published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. This connects to a broader principle within cognitive behavioral therapy, specifically separating a specific behavior or outcome from your broader, stable sense of identity tends to make difficult experiences considerably more psychologically workable and less likely to spiral into the kind of global identity level self-criticism that's harder to meaningfully address or update with new evidence. Let me address something about the timing and context of self-talk here, since I think there's genuinely important research on when certain self-talk strategies are most and least effective that deserves direct attention. Research examining self-talk before versus during a stressful or challenging task has found that the optimal strategy may actually differ depending on this timing, with some research suggesting that distance, third-person self-talk may be particularly valuable during anticipatory anxiety before a challenging event actually begins, while more immersed, encouraging first-person self-talk may serve a valuable motivational function once you're actively engaged in a demanding task itself. Citation, this research examining potentially differential optimal self-talk strategies depending on the specific timing relative to a stressful or challenging task has been discussed in sport and performance psychology literature, building on the broader self-distancing research framework. Though I want to be honest, this specific timing-based nuance represents a somewhat less definitively established, more actively researched area compared to the broader self-distancing findings we discussed earlier in this video. I want to spend time now on something genuinely important that connects self-talk research to sleep, given how much we've discussed sleep's importance across other videos on this channel. Research has found that pre-sleep rumination, negative, repetitive internal dialogue occurring, specifically as you're trying to fall asleep, is one of the more robust, well-established predictors of insomnia and poor sleep quality, and cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, one of the most extensively validated first-line treatments for chronic sleep difficulties, incorporates specific techniques directly targeting this pre-sleep self-talk pattern, including scheduled worry time earlier in the day, specifically designed to reduce the tendency for unresolved concerns to surface and intensify during the vulnerable, quiet period right before attempting sleep. Citation, this relationship between pre-sleep rumination and insomnia and the specific cognitive behavioral techniques targeting this pattern within CBT for insomnia protocols has been examined extensively in sleep medicine research published in journals including Sleep Medicine Reviews and the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. This offers a genuinely practical, specific application of everything we've discussed throughout this video, applied to a context, sleep onset, that affects nearly everyone at some point and connects directly to themes we've covered extensively elsewhere on this channel regarding sleep's foundational importance for nearly every other aspect of health we discuss. Let me bring in something about self-talk and physical pain perception here as well, since I think this represents a genuinely striking, somewhat underappreciated area of research. Studies examining self-talk strategies during experimentally induced pain and in clinical chronic pain populations have found that catastrophizing self-talk about pain, this is unbearable, this will never get better, is associated with measurably higher subjective pain ratings, and in some neuroimaging research, altered activity in pain processing brain regions, compared to individuals using more neutral or reappraisal-focused self-talk about the identical physical stimulus, citation, This relationship between catastrophizing self-talk specifically and both subjective pain intensity and objective pain processing brain activity has been examined extensively in pain psychology research published in journals including Pain and the Journal of Pain. This genuinely surprised me the first time I came across it in the literature. The specific internal narrative you construct about a painful physical sensation appears to meaningfully shape not just your subjective interpretation of that pain, but measurable activity within the brain's actual pain processing circuitry itself, which has become an increasingly important area of research within multidisciplinary chronic pain treatment, specifically where cognitive strategies targeting exactly this kind of catastrophizing self-talk have become a standard evidence-based component of comprehensive pain management approaches. I want to address something about social media and its relationship to self-talk here as well, since I think this is a genuinely relevant contemporary dimension of this conversation that deserves direct treatment. Research examining social media use and self-comparison has found that habitual social comparison through social media platforms is associated with increased negative self-talk and lower self-esteem, particularly among individuals who engage in what researchers call upward comparison, comparing themselves specifically to others who appear, often through curated, selectively presented content, to be doing better across some dimension, appearance, career, success, relationships, than the person doing the comparing, citation. This relationship between social media-driven upward social comparison and increased negative self-talk has been examined in research published in journals including the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking. This connects directly to everything we've discussed throughout this video, since the content and framing of these comparisons essentially becomes raw material that gets incorporated into your own internal self-talk, meaning the external inputs you're regularly exposing yourself to genuinely matter for the content and tone of the internal dialogue that follows, which is worth genuine. Honest reflection, if you notice your own self-talk, tends to become more critical or comparison-focused following periods of heavy social media engagement specifically. Let me talk about something related to gratitude practice here as well, since I think it connects meaningfully to the broader self-talk conversation, even though it's often discussed as a somewhat separate topic in popular content. Research on structured gratitude practices, regularly, deliberately reflecting on and articulating specific things you're grateful for, has found measurable benefits for mood and, in some research, physiological markers, including heart rate variability and inflammatory markers. And I think the mechanism connects directly to the self-talk framework we built throughout this video. Gratitude practice essentially represents a deliberate redirection of your internal narrative attention towards specific, genuine, positive elements of your experience, functioning as a kind of structured counterbalance to the default negativity bias that appears to be a genuine, evolutionarily rooted feature of human cognitive processing. More broadly, citation. This research on gratitude practice and its measurable psychological and physiological benefits has been examined extensively in positive psychology research, published in journals including the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and Psychological Science. And the underlying negativity bias in human cognition has been documented extensively in foundational cognitive psychology research. I want to spend some genuine time on this negativity bias concept directly, since I think it provides important foundational context for why negative self-talk seems to arise so much more readily and persistently than positive self-talk for most people without any particular effort required. Research in cognitive psychology has consistently found that negative information and experiences tend to be processed more quickly, remembered more vividly, and weighted more heavily in evaluative judgments compared to equivalently significant positive information, a pattern that appears to reflect deeply rooted, evolutionarily adaptive threat detection machinery, where accurately noticing and remembering potential dangers carried greater survival value throughout most of human evolutionary history than equally accurately noticing and remembering equivalent positive events, citation. This negativity bias in human cognitive processing and its evolutionary underpinnings has been established extensively in foundational cognitive and social psychology research, summarized in reviews published in the Review of General Psychology and Psychological Bulletin. This is genuinely useful context because it means the tendency toward more readily accessible, more persistent negative self-talk isn't a personal failing or a sign that something is uniquely wrong with you specifically. It reflects a genuinely universal feature of human cognitive architecture, which is precisely why the deliberate, effortful techniques we've discussed throughout this video, self-distancing, self-compassion, cognitive reappraisal, gratitude practice, matter so much. They're specifically counteracting a genuine built-in cognitive bias, not correcting some kind of unusual personal deficiency. Let me bring in something about mindfulness meditation's specific relationship to self-talk here as well, connecting to themes we discussed in a previous video on prayer and contemplative practice, but focus specifically now on its self-talk related mechanisms. Research examining mindfulness meditation practice has found associations with reduced rumination and, in some neuroimaging research, altered default mode network activity patterns, the same brain network we discussed earlier in the context of ruminative self-talk, with experienced meditators showing what researchers describe as reduced default mode network activity and altered connectivity patterns during rest, compared to non-meditators' citation. This relationship between mindfulness, meditation practice, and altered default mode network activity, particularly related to rumination, has been examined in contemplative neuroscience research published in journals including the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Neuroimage. Beyond the neuroimaging findings, mindfulness practice specifically appears to cultivate a particular relationship to self-talk that connects directly to the self-compassion component we discussed earlier. Learning to notice and observe your own internal dialogue with a degree of detached, non-judgmental awareness, rather than either being fully absorbed in and controlled by that internal narrative, or trying to forcefully suppress or argue with it. Citation, this specific quality of non-judgmental, observational awareness toward one's own thoughts as a core mechanism of mindfulness-based interventions has been discussed extensively in clinical psychology research on mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction protocols. I want to address mindfulness-based cognitive therapy specifically here, since it represents a genuinely important, well-validated clinical integration of exactly the themes we've been discussing throughout this entire video. This approach, developed specifically to help prevent relapse in individuals with a history of recurrent depression, combines traditional cognitive behavioral techniques, the kind of thought restructuring and reappraisal we discussed earlier with mindfulness meditation practice specifically, and has been found in multiple randomized controlled trials to meaningfully reduce depressive relapse rates, particularly in individuals with a history of 3 or more previous depressive episodes, citation, Siegel, Williams, and Teasdale. This mindfulness-based cognitive therapy approach and its demonstrated efficacy for preventing depressive relapse has been established through extensive randomized controlled trial research published in journals including JAMA Psychiatry and Archives of General Psychiatry. I mention this specifically because I think it represents a genuinely important, clinically validated demonstration that the combination of techniques we've discussed throughout this entire video, cognitive reappraisal, mindful, non-judgmental observation of self-talk, and self-compassion, aren't simply interesting, individually studied research findings existing in isolation. They've been formally combined into structured, clinically validated treatment protocols with genuine, replicated evidence for meaningfully improving long-term mental health outcomes. Let me talk about something related to physical posture and self-talk here as well, since I think this represents a genuinely interesting, if somewhat more preliminary, area of research connecting the body and mind in a way relevant to this entire conversation. Some research has examined whether physical posture during self-talk or reflection influences the content and tone of that self-talk, with preliminary findings suggesting that upright, expansive postures may be associated with somewhat more confident, positively toned self-talk compared to slumped, contracted postures. Though I want to be honest that this specific body of research, often associated with the broader, somewhat contested concept of power posing, has faced significant replication challenges in more rigorous, larger scale follow-up studies. And I don't want to overstate the current strength of evidence here. Citation, this posture and self-talk research area, including both the original findings and the subsequent replication difficulties that have led researchers to treat the strongest original claims with considerable caution, has been discussed extensively in the psychological science replication literature, including direct replication attempts published in journals, including Psychological Science and Comprehensive Results in Social Psychology. I think it's genuinely important to include this specific example of a more contested, less definitively established finding within this video, because I want to model the kind of honest, appropriately calibrated confidence that should apply across this entire body of research. Some of what we've discussed today, the self-distancing research, the cognitive reappraisal research, the default mode network and rumination research rests on genuinely robust, well-replicated evidence, while other adjacent claims, like the specific posture research we just discussed, remain considerably more preliminary and contested. And I think being clear about which category a given claim falls into matters for how much confidence you should place in it. I want to bring in something about self-talk across different cultural contexts here as well, since I think this deserves honest acknowledgement, given how much of the foundational research we've discussed throughout this video was conducted primarily in Western, largely North American populations. Some cross-cultural research examining self-talk and emotion regulation strategies has found meaningful variation across different cultural contexts, with some research suggesting that certain self-distancing and self-compassion techniques may operate somewhat differently, or carry different specific cultural framing and effectiveness in collectivist cultural contexts compared to the more individualist cultural context where much of this foundational research originated. Citation: this cross-cultural variation in self-talk patterns and emotion regulation strategy effectiveness has been examined in cross-cultural psychology research published in journals including Emotion and the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, though I want to be honest that this represents a considerably less extensively developed area of research compared to the foundational, largely Western population-based studies we've discussed throughout most of this video, and represents a genuine acknowledged gap in the current literature that would benefit from further, more extensive cross-cultural research to establish how broadly these specific findings and techniques generalize. Let me address something about children and the development of healthy self-talk patterns here as well, connecting back to the developmental origins conversation we had earlier, but now focus specifically on practical, forward-looking application for anyone raising or working with children. Research examining interventions specifically designed to help children develop healthier self-talk patterns, teaching self-distancing and cognitive reappraisal techniques adapted for developmentally appropriate use in school and family settings, has found genuine, measurable benefits for emotion regulation and resilience. Citation: this research on self-talk and emotion regulation interventions, specifically designed and validated for use with children, has been examined in developmental and educational psychology research published in journals including Developmental Psychology and Emotion. This connects back to the developmental origins research we discussed earlier in a genuinely constructive, forward-looking way. If these patterns are indeed substantially learned through early language exposure and modeling, then deliberately, thoughtfully modeling and teaching healthier self-talk patterns to the children in your life represents a genuinely evidence-supported way of helping shape more resilient, adaptive internal dialogue patterns from an earlier developmental stage, rather than requiring the more effortful adult unlearning and relearning process that a lot of the techniques discussed throughout this video are specifically designed to address. Let me bring this entire considerably expanded conversation to its genuine close now. Everything we've covered across this video, the neurological machinery underlying inner speech, the specific physiological consequences of ruminative chatter, the well-validated techniques of self-distancing, temporal distancing, self-compassion, and genuine cognitive reappraisal, the important, honest distinction between well-supported, values-based self-affirmation and the more mixed evidence for generic positive statements, the developmental origins of self-talk patterns and their genuine modifiability in adulthood, the deep integration of these principles into clinically validated treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and the additional More granular pieces we've added in this expanded section: the specific linguistic patterns worth noticing, the sleep connection, the pain perception connection, the social media and comparison dimension, the foundational negativity bias, explaining why this all requires deliberate effort in the first place. All of it points toward the same central message this video opened with. The internal voice narrating your daily experience is neither a fixed, unchangeable feature of your identity, nor is it something to simply ignore as inconsequential background noise. It's a genuine, measurable, physiologically consequential process shaped initially by early developmental influences largely outside your control, but demonstrably, repeatedly shown across a substantial body of rigorous research to remain modifiable in adulthood through specific, learnable, evidence-based techniques. If you want the complete, structured system for actually building these techniques into your daily life, including specific practice exercises, guidance on navigating which technique tends to be most useful in which specific context, and a genuine framework for tracking your own progress and shifting your internal dialogue over time, all of that is laid out in considerably more depth in the ebooks I've linked in the description below. If you've made it through this entire considerably detailed exploration of self-talk and the brain, you clearly want to genuinely understand and improve your relationship with your own internal voice, rather than simply continuing to let it run unexamined. So go take a look. It's exactly the kind of resource built to help you take everything we've covered today and turn it into a real, sustained, evidence-based shift in how you talk to yourself starting today. This video discusses general psychological and neuroscience research on self-talk for informational and educational purposes only, and does not constitute personalized mental health advice or diagnosis. If you're experiencing persistent, significant symptoms of anxiety, depression, or other mental health concerns that are affecting your daily functioning, please consider reaching out to a qualified mental health professional who can provide personalized assessment and support beyond what general, self-directed techniques alone can offer. This is a sensitive topic for some viewers, and if anything discussed here brings up difficult personal experiences, that's a completely understandable response, and support is available if you'd like help finding appropriate resources.